Dear listener, the first sign something was wrong wasn't the sirens. It was the silence between them. I was standing alone in the upper control room of Gray Ridge Hydroelectric Dam, watching the late morning sun reflect off the reservoir. It was a routine inspection day. Turbine load steady. Water inflow moderate from upstream rainfall. Nothing unusual. It was the kind of day where the only sound was the low mechanical hum of generators, converting gravity into electricity. Then every monitor flickered. At first, I thought it was a grid fluctuation. That happened occasionally when regional demand spiked. But instead of stabilizing, the screens cut to an emergency broadcast overlay. A harsh tone filled the room, sharp enough to vibrate through the glass panels overlooking the spillway. This is not a test. The voice trembled despite trying not to. Reports of violent attacks. Multiple cities. Civilians urged to remain indoors. Avoid physical contact. Avoid crowds. The phrasing was careful, almost clinical, but beneath it was panic barely restrained. I turned down the volume and stepped closer to the main surveillance console. Cameras lining the access road showed 2 maintenance trucks pulling away from the lower parking area faster than safety protocols allowed. No scheduled departure had been logged. My phone buzzed. 3 missed calls from a coworker who had left earlier that morning. A text followed, "Lock yourself in." It's spreading fast. Spreading. The word carried weight I didn't like. I switched the exterior cameras to zoom. The access road curved along the riverbank before reaching the dam's main gate. Usually, it was empty except for the occasional fisherman or delivery vehicle. Now I saw a sedan stopped sideways across the entrance. The driver's door hung open. 2 figures stumbled near the security barrier. They moved wrong. Not drunk. Not injured. Jerking uncoordinated, but fast when they lunged toward something out of frame. A third figure ran into view. Even through muted audio, I could tell by the body language, arms flailing, desperate backward steps, that this wasn't an argument. The first figure tackled him. I forced myself to keep watching. I needed information more than comfort. The dam sat 40 miles from the nearest major town. We were elevated above the valley, surrounded by forest and water. Isolation has always been its drawback. Now it might be the only advantage left. The emergency broadcast continued looping. Infection, aggression, collapse of emergency services. No clear explanation. No reassurance. I opened the internal systems dashboard. The regional grid connection indicator flashed unstable. Transmission lines were overloading. If the grid failed entirely, the dam would default to safe mode, reducing output. That would buy time, but only if someone was here to manage it. Someone was here. Another buzz from my phone. This time it was my sister. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to understand the scale of this before panic reached through the glass and into the room with me. On the lower dock camera, I saw something worse. A maintenance supervisor I recognized was sprinting toward the river access ladder. Behind him, 3 of those unsteady figures closed the distance with unnatural speed. He didn't make it. The camera shook as one of them slammed into the mounted pole. Then the feed cut to static. The hum of the generators felt louder now. The spillway gate stood closed, holding back billions of gallons of water. The structure beneath my feet was reinforced concrete, designed to withstand pressure beyond imagination. It was built to control chaos. Outside, chaos was rising anyway. I had 2 options: leave while the road might still be passable, or seal the control room and trust that elevation, steel, and concrete would outlast whatever this was. On the far camera, more figures approached the gate. The road was already lost. I stepped toward the reinforced door and engaged the internal lock system. Steel bolts slid into place with mechanical certainty. If the world was collapsing, it would have to do it below me. I waited 10 full minutes before moving again. The cameras showed no change on the access road. The sedan still blocked the gate, its door hanging open like a warning left unfinished. No emergency vehicles were coming. The grid indicator blinked red, then green, then red again. I understood what that meant. The outside world was destabilizing faster than our infrastructure could compensate. I unlocked my phone and finally answered my sister. Her voice was already breaking. She didn't ask where I was. She told me to stay put. Cities were burning. Police weren't responding. People were attacking each other in the streets. I kept my responses short, controlled. I didn't describe what I'd seen on the cameras. She asked if I could drive home. I looked back at the monitors. More figures were gathering near the gate now. Not wandering, not confused. They were drawn to movement, to sound. The dam's turbines vibrated through the valley like a heartbeat. If they associated that vibration with activity, they would stay. I told her I couldn't leave. I told her the road was blocked. I told her I loved her. Then I ended the call before fear infected my own voice. I moved through the control room with deliberate calm. The reinforced door was already sealed, but the lower maintenance entrance was not. That door led to the turbine hall and the service corridor beneath the spillway. If anyone reached it, concrete would not matter. I descended the metal staircase, counting each step automatically. Routine had always kept mistakes small. I intended to keep it that way. The turbine hall felt cavernous and exposed compared to the glassed-in control room above. The noise here was constant, mechanical thunder rolling along steel and water. I checked the maintenance door bolts, then added a secondary chain lock from the equipment locker. Redundancy over confidence. I powered down non-essential lighting in the lower level to reduce visible glow through any cracks. Light signaled life. Life attracted attention. I returned to the control room and locked the interior stairwell behind me. The act felt final. Not temporary shelter, but chosen isolation. I opened the structural blueprints stored in the operations terminal. The dam was designed to withstand catastrophic flood pressure, seismic tremors, and equipment failure. It was not designed for siege. Still, its elevation gave me an advantage. The control room sat 200 feet above river level, accessible only by internal stairs or the secured elevator. I disabled the elevator entirely. If power failed, it would trap anyone inside between floors. I preferred predictable stairs. From the observation windows, the reservoir looked unchanged. Sunlight scattered across its surface, indifferent to whatever was happening beyond the tree line. That contrast unsettled me. Nature remained stable, while human systems collapsed in hours. I ran an inventory of everything inside the control room. Bottled water in the emergency cabinet, protein bars, first aid kits, a handheld radio, 2 fire extinguishers. A single sidearm in the security locker, rarely used. The dam could generate electricity, but it could not manufacture food. I would need to ration carefully and think long-term from the beginning. Impulse would kill me faster than infection. I adjusted turbine output to minimum stable levels, reducing vibration that carried through the valley. If fewer mechanical cues reached the road, fewer infections might linger. I shut down exterior floodlights that normally illuminated the bridge at night. Darkness would hide the structure as much as it protected intruders. Safety and risk were now intertwined. I sat in the operator's chair and watched the gate camera until my eyes burned. The figures outside multiplied as the afternoon wore on. They pressed against the barrier without coordination, responding only when one of them stumbled or collided. No strategy, just persistence. But persistence could overwhelm steel if given enough time. I understood then that this wasn't a temporary lockdown. It was the beginning of something long. I had chosen concrete over chaos, height over movement, control over escape. Now I would have to prove that choice could hold. Outside, the road dissolved into disorder, but inside, the turbines still answered to my hands. I would not abandon this position. Not yet. The grid failed just after dusk. The warning lights across the operations panel blinked in uneven rhythm before settling into a solid red band that stretched across the transmission display. External demand had spiked beyond capacity, then vanished altogether. The regional network was gone. Whatever remained of the outside world was no longer drawing power from us. Inside the dam, however, the turbines were still spinning. I leaned forward and switched the system to island mode, isolating the facility from the dead grid. The hum beneath my feet steadied as the generators adjusted to internal load only. Without transmission strain, the turbines sounded almost calm, like a machine finally relieved of responsibility. It was a strange contrast. Outside, collapse. Inside, controlled energy. Electricity was now mine to manage. The control room lights felt brighter than necessary. I dimmed them immediately. Excess illumination meant unnecessary drain. Even though the turbines could theoretically run for months with consistent water flow, auxiliary systems were a different matter. Cooling pumps, ventilation fans, monitoring servers, they all consumed power. I opened the facility's internal schematic and began rerouting circuits. Priority 1, control systems and essential monitoring. Priority 2, limited lighting and security feeds. Everything else shut down. The break rooms went dark. Office terminals powered off. The hallway heaters clicked into silence. The dam was no longer an employer. It was a bunker. I checked the reservoir levels. Upstream rainfall had been moderate, enough to maintain steady inflow without requiring spillway release. As long as water kept moving through the intake gates, the turbines would continue producing energy. Nature was now my silent partner in survival. But energy without purpose was waste. I walked the perimeter of the control room, counting outlets and eliminating phantom loads. Even idle devices drew current. I unplugged the coffee maker, the microwave, and the unused maintenance laptop. Small savings accumulated over time. Discipline mattered more than comfort. On the surveillance wall, I switched several exterior cameras to motion-triggered recording rather than continuous streaming. The monitors flickered as feeds went dark. Each black square felt like surrendering vision, but conserving power meant choosing what I truly needed to see. Outside, shapes still clustered near the access gate. They drifted when wind rattled the fencing, then gathered again when vibration from the turbine floor carried outward. I reduced rotational speed slightly, just enough to minimize structural tremor while maintaining minimal internal supply. The hum softened. The dam felt less alive. I paused, listening. The difference was subtle but measurable. Sound traveled differently through concrete than it did through open air. By lowering output, I was decreasing the acoustic footprint that might draw attention. Less power meant less presence. Safety through reduction. I pulled a legal pad from the operations desk and began writing consumption projections. If I maintained current internal load, auxiliary systems could operate indefinitely as long as inflow remained steady. The vulnerability wasn't generation, it was mechanical wear. Bearings, coolant seals, filters. If something critical failed and I lacked replacement parts, the turbines would stall. I would need preventative maintenance schedules adjusted for single-person operation. The realization settled over me slowly. I was no longer just an operator following procedures. I was an engineer, technician, and power manager. Every decision had multiplied consequence. I powered down the elevator completely, diverting its reserved line back into control systems. I shut off decorative floodlights lining the upper observation deck. Darkness pressed against the windows almost immediately, turning the glass into a mirror reflecting my own tired face. For the first time since sealing the door, I allowed myself a measured breath. Outside, cities might be blacked out and burning. Here, beneath reinforced concrete and flowing water, I still had control over something fundamental. Light, heat, systems that obeyed physics rather than panic. But control was conditional. If water stopped, If equipment failed, if too many systems ran unchecked, this sanctuary would dim like everything else. Power was not invincibility. It was a tool that demanded discipline. I returned to the main console and logged the time of grid collapse in the operations journal. No supervisor would read it. No report would be filed upstream. The act was for me. As long as the turbines turned, this place would remain ordered. And as long as it remained ordered, I had a chance to outlast the disorder below. Water surrounded me in every direction, yet none of it was safe to drink. That irony settled heavier than the concrete walls. I stood at the observation glass, watching the reservoir press against the dam, billions of gallons held back by engineered certainty. Below, turbines converted that pressure into electricity, but none of that raw water was filtered for human consumption inside the control room. My drinking supply amounted to 3 sealed cases in the emergency locker, and whatever condensation I could reclaim from maintenance reserves. Abundance outside, scarcity within. I began inventory with clinical detachment. The vending machines in the lower corridor were stocked for staff convenience, not siege conditions. I pried open the front panel with a maintenance screwdriver and removed every packaged item, counting calories rather than flavor. Protein bars, salted peanuts, energy drinks, candy that would spike and crash blood sugar if consumed carelessly. I stacked everything on the conference table and wrote projected intake beside each category. If I limited myself to 1,200 calories per day, I could stretch solid food close to 90 days. 90 days was both reassuring and terrifying. 3 months of survival or 3 months of waiting. Water required a different approach. In the maintenance bay, I located industrial filter cartridges intended for emergency use during contamination events. They were not designed for long-term habitation, but they could purify intake from the internal washed-on lines. I disconnected one line feeding the turbine housing and rerouted it through a portable filtration rig, assembled from spare tubing and clamps. It was inelegant, but it worked. I filled the first metal canteen and held it under the light, checking for sediment. Clear enough. I drank slowly, not because I doubted the filtration, but because habit now demanded restraint. Hydration without waste became the rule. I logged every liter consumed in the operations journal beside turbine output and reservoir levels. Data offered the illusion of control, and I needed that illusion to remain functional. Outside the reinforced glass, figures drifted along the shoreline, drawn by nothing visible. They bent toward the water occasionally, as if scent alone guided them. I wondered if they felt thirsty. The thought unsettled me more than their aggression. Hunger and violence were predictable responses to collapse. Thirst was universal. If instinct drove them toward water, the dam would remain a beacon. I shut down the exterior maintenance pumps to minimize runoff, noise along the spillway. Less sound meant fewer variables. I returned to the table and divided the food into weekly allotments, sealing each stack inside labeled plastic bins. Rationing transformed panic into procedure. The procedure reduced fear to numbers. I calculated the margin for error and found there was almost none. If supplies dwindled before the world stabilized, I would have to expand beyond concrete. For now, the dam provided power and filtered water. It did not provide comfort. As night settled across the reservoir, I ate my first measured portion in silence. Each bite carried calculation rather than taste. Concrete and steel had given me elevation and electricity, but survival would depend on restraint. I leaned back in the operator chair and listened to the softened hum beneath my feet. The dam held back water through pressure and design. I would have to hold back hunger and fear the same way. Outside, the spillway remained dark, a black ribbon cutting through the valley. Somewhere beyond the tree line, whatever this outbreak continued spreading without pause. I could not influence that. I could only manage intake valves, energy draw, and the rhythm of my own consumption. The contrast felt almost absurd. Human systems were collapsing in hours, while hydraulic systems obeyed equations written decades ago. I trusted the equations. They did not panic, and they did not lie. If I could reduce my needs to numbers as well, I might outlast whatever waited below the bridge. I closed the operations journal and set an alarm for 4-hour intervals, a reminder to drink, to eat, to check systems before fatigue distorted judgment. Survival, like power generation, depended on consistency rather than intensity. I would measure days by intake and output, not fear. That discipline would keep me alive. By the third morning, the bridge had become a study in repetition. I positioned the central surveillance feed on the largest monitor and reduced the others to thumbnail view. The access bridge stretched from the forested ridge across the river gorge and terminated at the reinforced gate below the dam. It had always been a simple span of concrete and steel, designed for maintenance trucks and occasional visitors. Now it was a corridor of movement for something else. They didn't arrive all at once. They drifted in ones and twos from the tree line, drawn first by sound, then by each other. When one stumbled against the gate or the abandoned sedan, others followed, not out of coordination but response. They reacted to the disturbance. Vibration carried through the structure like a signal flare. I leaned closer to the monitor and muted the ambient microphone feed. Sound had become a liability. Observation required silence. Their movement patterns were inconsistent, but not random. During early morning hours, they were slower, almost wandering. Near midday, when turbine output rose slightly to maintain internal stability, I noticed increased agitation near the bridge supports. The concrete transmitted subtle tremors from the spinning shafts below. The infected seemed to sense that disturbance through their feet or through the structure itself. I tested a theory. I reduced rotational speed by 3%, just enough to minimize vibration without destabilizing voltage to internal systems. The hum beneath the floor softened again. Over the next hour, activity on the bridge decreased marginally. A few figures remained pressed against the gate, but the cluster thinned. It wasn't controlled, but it was influence. The dam amplified certain frequencies along the intake chambers and spillway conduits. When wind funneled through the lower sluice openings, it produced a hollow resonance that echoed outward. Twice, that echo triggered renewed movement across the bridge. They were not intelligent in any strategic sense, but they were reactive. Stimulus, response. Over and over. I documented each fluctuation in the operations journal: time, turbine speed, external activity count. Data mattered more than fear. If I could identify patterns, I could minimize exposure. One figure separated from the group and walked directly toward the center of the bridge, stopping as if listening. Its head tilted slightly, its posture was slackened but balanced. I studied it closely. Clothing torn, skin discolored, gait uneven yet persistent. It wasn't decaying rapidly the way a corpse should. Something preserved muscle function, at least temporarily. The idea of decay without deterioration unsettled me. By late afternoon, the bridge population had grown to nearly 20. They pressed against the gate without coordination, hands dragging along steel bars, bodies colliding and separating again. Occasionally one would fall, only to rise minutes later. Endurance without purpose. The dam stood 200 feet above them, but elevation didn't eliminate risk. If enough of them accumulated weight against the gate, hinges could fail. If the sedan shifted and created access along the guardrail, some might tumble into the lower maintenance road that wrapped beneath the spillway. Height was protection, not immunity. I zoomed in on the lower riverbank camera. Several had begun wandering along the shoreline beneath the bridge. They bent toward the water but did not drink. They seemed more interested in movement than sustenance. A memory surfaced uninvited, my sister's voice on the phone asking if I could drive home. Home was now a meaningless coordinate. The dam was the only defensible geometry left. As evening settled, the sky darkened to violet above the reservoir. I powered down additional exterior feeds, leaving only the gate and shoreline active. Every watt conserved extended internal viability. Every watt spent carried a cost. In the dim reflection of the monitor, I saw myself superimposed over the bridge, alive, thinking, calculating. Below, the infected moved without plan, driven by impulses I could not fully map. The contrast sharpened something inside me. Their persistence depended on instinct. Mine would depend on discipline. I adjusted turbine speed once more before nightfall, minimizing structural vibration as far as possible. The hum receded to a steady whisper. Outside, the bridge figures continued their restless motion, but fewer of them struck the gate. Concrete and steel were allies, but only if I understood how sound traveled through them. Watching the dead cross the bridge wasn't morbid fascination, it was research. Every stumble, every pause, every surge toward vibration offered information. And information, unlike fear, could be managed. The alarm sounded at 02:17. Not loud, not urgent, just a sharp deviation in the steady rhythm of system indicators. I was half asleep in the operator's chair when the cooling efficiency graph dipped below threshold. Turbine 2 showed rising temperature along the upper bearing assembly. Left unchecked, it would cascade into full shutdown within hours. Mechanical failure was not dramatic. It was quiet, progressive, indifferent. I checked the diagnostics panel. Coolant flow rate had dropped by nearly 12%. That meant blockage or pump degradation. The maintenance access for that line ran through the lower turbine corridor, just 50 feet from the exterior intake housing. 50 feet above ground level, but still closer to the outside than I had been since sealing the door. I shut down turbine 2 preemptively, reducing load on the remaining units. The hum beneath my feet shifted, slightly uneven now. Power remained stable for internal systems, but redundancy was thinning. I grabbed the handheld flashlight, a wrench kit, and the sidearm from the security locker, not because I expected a confrontation, but because contingency planning had become instinct. The descent down the metal staircase felt longer than usual, each step amplified by reduced turbine noise. The dam was quieter without full output, and that silence made every movement sound intrusive. I paused at the landing and listened. No pounding on lower doors. No metallic scraping from outside access points. Only the echo of water coursing through concrete channels. In the turbine hall, residual heat lingered near the casing. I approached turbine 2 carefully and felt along the coolant conduit. The external pump housing vibrated weakly, inconsistent with standard flow. I shut the intake valve manually and opened the inspection panel. A slurry of silt and debris clogged the filter mesh, likely drawn in from increased upstream runoff. The irony was sharp. The very water sustaining my survival threatened the machinery preserving it. I removed the mesh filter and rinsed it using filtered internal water, working quickly but methodically. Each metallic clink reverberated along the chamber walls. I forced myself to slow down. Panic translated into noise. Noise translated into risk. Halfway through reassembly, a faint echo traveled from the lower intake tunnel. Not mechanical. Irregular. I froze. 3 seconds later, another impact, steel against something heavy. I moved toward the security monitor mounted near the maintenance door and activated the external intake camera. A single infected figure pressed against the outer grate, drawn perhaps by residual vibration from earlier turbine output. The door between us was reinforced steel rated against flood pressure, not assault. Still, repetition could compromise hinges over time. I returned to the pump housing and secured the filter in place, tightening bolts until torque resistance felt correct. Efficiency before curiosity. I reopened the intake valve slowly. Coolant flow began to normalize, temperature readings stabilizing within safe margins. Turbine 2 could remain offline temporarily, but leaving it inactive too long would reduce overall structural balance within the system. I restarted it at minimal rotational speed, easing it back into the load sequence. Another dull impact echoed from below. The infected figure had begun striking the grate repeatedly, likely responding to the shift in vibration as Turbine 2 resumed motion. I reduced output again by 1%, and observed through the camera. The figure's movement slowed almost immediately, as if stimulus had faded. That confirmed the pattern. Sound and vibration were invitations. I sealed the maintenance panel and collected my tools, moving deliberately back toward the staircase. Mechanical integrity had been restored for now, but the cost was awareness. The dam could fail in small ways, long before it failed catastrophically. Each pump, each seal, each filter was a variable in a system I now operated alone. At the top of the stairs, I paused and listened again. The hum had returned to a steady cadence. Cooling metrics remained within acceptable range. Outside, the infected figure drifted from the grate and wandered along the riverbank. I locked the interior stairwell behind me and returned to the control room. The first mechanical failure had not breached the dam, but it had exposed the fragility beneath reinforced concrete. Isolation did not eliminate maintenance. Elevation did not eliminate entropy. From this point forward, survival would depend not just on sealing doors, but on sustaining systems minute by minute. I didn't realize how far a wrench could echo until I dropped it. The metal struck the turbine casing and bounced once before clattering onto the concrete floor. The sound detonated inside the chamber, ricocheting along curved walls and through intake tunnels like a gunshot underwater. For a moment, even the steady turbine hum seemed to recoil. I stood still, counting breaths. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then the first answering impact came from below. It wasn't immediate panic, just a sharp strike against the lower access door. Then another. Then a dragging scrape along the steel seam where the door met its frame. The dam carried vibration outward, but it also carried it inward. I had sent a signal without meaning to. I moved to the nearest wall-mounted camera and switched to the intake corridor feed. 3 infected had gathered at the outer steel door beneath the turbine hall. They weren't coordinated, but they were persistent. One slammed shoulder first into the reinforced panel. Another clawed at the hinge. The door was flood-rated. It could withstand thousands of gallons of pressure. It was never designed for repeated impact from bodies. The mistake was mine. I shut down Turbine 3 entirely, reducing internal vibration to near silence. The hum softened again, and the sudden quiet felt unnatural, like holding breath too long. The infected outside paused. Their movement slowed. They pressed their heads against the steel, as if listening for something that had just disappeared. Sound had drawn them. Silence confused them. I remained motionless, watching the monitor, resisting the urge to retreat immediately upstairs. If they associated mechanical vibration with activity inside, I needed to know how quickly that association faded. Data mattered more than comfort. 2 of them drifted away after several minutes. The third remained, striking the door intermittently as though uncertain whether to persist. I checked the structural pressure reading on the lower hinge assembly. Minimal stress so far. The door could hold. But repetition over hours, days, weeks, that was another equation. I retrieved the dropped wrench slowly, lifting it rather than sliding it across the floor. Every movement now felt amplified in my mind, even if it wasn't physically louder. Awareness sharpened reflexes, but also heightened fear. I refused to let the latter dictate pace. On the monitor, the remaining infected shifted focus to the intake grate beside the door. Its fingers hooked into the metal mesh, testing gaps. The grate was narrower than a human skull. It would not yield. But observation revealed something important. They responded not only to vibration, but to sudden acoustic spikes. Impact sounds carried over water more efficiently than a steady mechanical hum. The reservoir acted like an amplifier. Surface waves transmitted low frequencies outward along the gorge, while sharp sounds traveled through air and concrete simultaneously. The dam was not a silent fortress, it was an acoustic instrument. I powered down all non-essential interior devices again, eliminating even faint auxiliary buzz. The turbine floor now vibrated at the lowest stable threshold. In the control room above, I muted keyboard tones and silenced alarm chimes where possible. Even small signals might cascade into attention below. Over the next half hour, the infected outside lost interest. The third one drifted away from the intake door and wandered toward the riverbank, drawn perhaps by some other disturbance farther downstream. Silence had won. I returned to the control room and sat heavily in the operator's chair. My pulse had been elevated for longer than I realized. It wasn't the threat of breach that unsettled me. It was the understanding that the dam itself could betray me through physics. Concrete transmitted vibration. Steel amplified impact. Water carried frequencies beyond sight. I opened the operations journal and added a new rule: no dropped tools. No sudden impacts. Controlled movement at all times. The world below had become reactive to the smallest cues. I could not afford impulsive motion inside a structure designed to resonate. Safety was no longer just reinforced doors and elevation. It was discipline measured in decibels. The hum beneath my feet resumed its steady cadence once I brought Turbine 3 back online at reduced speed. Outside, the bridge remained occupied, but the lower intake door stood untouched. Sound carried over water. From this point forward, I would treat every object in my hands like a potential alarm. The rain began sometime after midnight. I heard it before I saw it, a steady impact against the observation glass, soft at first, then building into a sustained hiss across the reservoir. By morning, upstream inflow data confirmed what the sound suggested. Water levels were rising faster than expected. The dam was designed for this. Flood events were not anomalies. They were calculations embedded into the structure's blueprint. But calculations assumed a full operational team. Now it was just me. I pulled up the reservoir projection model. If rainfall continued at current intensity for another 12 hours, the water line would approach the upper tolerance threshold. Past that, pressure against the spillway gates would exceed optimal stress limits. Structural safety required a controlled release. Controlled release meant noise. The spillway gates, when opened, did not whisper. They roared. Water cascading down concrete channels generated vibration, strong enough to register on seismic monitors miles away. If a subtle turbine hum had drawn infected toward the bridge, spillway discharge would be an invitation written in thunder. I stood at the console weighing the equation: long-term structural integrity versus short-term exposure. If I delayed release, internal pressure would continue building, increasing strain on the dam's face. Microfractures were invisible until they were. Concrete fatigue didn't negotiate. I zoomed in on the exterior cameras. The bridge still hosted scattered infected, fewer than before but persistent. Lower shoreline figures drifted near the intake. If the spillway opened, the valley would echo with force. I checked the wind direction. Northeastern moderate. Sound would travel downstream along the gorge, not back toward the forested ridge. That mattered. I reduced turbine output to minimum safe load and isolated non-essential systems. When the gates opened, vibration would surge through the entire structure. Better to lower internal resonance beforehand. My hands hovered over the spillway control levers. I opened gate 1 by 10%. The initial release was sharp metallic, followed by a deep concussion as water struck the concrete chute below. The observation windows trembled lightly. Outside, white torrents exploded down the spillway, carving a violent path into the river channel. Within seconds, movement erupted across the bridge. Figures turned toward the sound. Some staggered forward. Others dropped to their hands and knees, as if overwhelmed by vibration. The noise was colossal, drowning out even the internal hum of the turbines. For a moment, I questioned whether the gate would jam mid-release, trapping the mechanism under uneven stress. I held position at 10%, monitoring pressure gauges. Reservoir levels began to stabilize gradually. The structural load graph dipped back towards safe margins. Physics was responding predictably, even if the world outside was not. On the intake camera, infected clustered along the lower riverbank, drawn toward the cascade. They slipped on wet stones, collided, and rose again. The spillway had become the loudest object in the valley. But it was temporary. After 20 minutes, I closed Gate 1 slowly. The roar diminished in stages, returning to steady rain and distant river flow. I watched the infected through the cameras. Without sustained vibration, their focus began to scatter. Some remained near the chute, others drifted back toward the bridge. The dam had survived the surge. So had I. The decision had been correct. Structural integrity demanded action, even if action carried risk. Delaying would have been emotional avoidance disguised as caution. I logged the discharge event in the operations journal, noting duration, inflow rate, and external activity spike. Data turned instinct into record. Record allowed improvement. Outside, the spillway still streamed residual runoff, but the explosive cascade had subsided. The bridge population remained larger than before the release, yet disorganized. They had reacted, not coordinated. I leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly. Engineering logic had overridden fear. The dam was not merely shelter. It was a system that required management independent of outside chaos. Ignoring its needs would eventually destroy the very refuge I depended on. As the rain tapered into lighter drizzle, I recalculated reservoir projections for the next 12 hours. If precipitation eased, no further discharge would be required. If it intensified again, I would repeat the process with tighter intervals. Outside, the valley carried the last echoes of the spillway's roar. Inside, the turbines resumed their controlled rhythm. Power and pressure were constant forces. The difference between collapse and survival lay in timing their release. The radio crackled at 21:43. I had been logging turbine temperature readings when the static broke pattern. It wasn't the usual atmospheric interference or looping emergency broadcast. This was intermittent, uneven, like someone testing transmission strength. I froze with my pen mid-sentence and reached for the handheld receiver on the console. For weeks, the radio had been nothing but silence and dead repetition. I had kept it powered on out of habit more than hope. Now hope answered back. Anyone receiving downstream, repeat downstream survivors. The voice cut out, replaced by static. I adjusted the antenna and shifted frequency slightly, searching for clarity. The signal returned, faint but distinct. This is a small group located 20 miles south along the river corridor. If you can hear this, respond. We have limited supplies. We're establishing contact points. My chest tightened in a way mechanical alarms never caused. Human cadence. Human breath between words. Not panic, not pre-recorded. Alive. I waited until the static thinned again before pressing transmit. This is Gray Ridge Dam Control. Single occupant. Receiving your signal. Confirm, repeat. Silence followed. Then a burst of interference. Then the same voice, slightly clearer. Gray Ridge confirms structure intact. We've seen flooding along lower towns. Bridge routes compromised. Flooding. That explained why shoreline infected numbers had fluctuated unpredictably over recent days. Downstream chaos had likely pushed movement toward the valley. Structure intact, I replied. Operating in isolated power mode. Limited resources. What's your head count? 7. 2 injured. No heavy transport. We're stationary for now. 7. The word carried weight heavier than turbine output calculations. 7 people meant shared labor, shared watch rotations, shared repair capacity. It also meant shared consumption, shared risk. I turned my chair toward the observation glass. The reservoir lay dark beyond the window, the spillway silent under starlight. For weeks, isolation had been a protection. Now connection offers possibility and exposure. Gray Ridge, you still there? The voice asked. I'm here, I answered. Road access to the dam is blocked. Bridge compromised by infected presence. River approach possible but hazardous. Current shoreline activity moderate. Understood, the voice replied. We're evaluating options. Food supply is low. We may attempt movement north if conditions stabilize. Movement north meant toward me. I considered the geometry. The dam provided elevation, power, and filtered water. It did not provide surplus food. Adding 7 people would strain rations beyond sustainable limits unless supply routes were secured. But remaining alone carried a different kind of depletion. What's your fuel situation? I asked. Minimal. Engine noise draws attention. We've been silent for days. Silence had kept me alive as well. I shifted frequencies briefly, scanning for other transmissions. Nothing. The valley beyond the reservoir felt empty, except for this single thread of connection. Maintain radio schedule at 21:30 daily, I instructed. Signal duration is limited to reduce detection. If you move, confirm via coded phrase. Water holds. I'll respond with concrete stands. A pause, then a faint exhale of relief on the other end. Copy that. Water holds. Concrete stands. The repetition felt like a pact. I released the transmit button and set the receiver back on the console. The control room hummed softly around me, turbines steady, reservoir level stable. For the first time since sealing the door, isolation felt less absolute. But connection changed the equation. 7 survivors downstream meant a potential alliance. It also meant potential vulnerability. If they reached the reservoir shoreline, I would have to decide whether to open controlled access routes or remain sealed above concrete and steel. Safety versus sustainability. Alone, I could ration precisely. Together, we could fortify beyond one person's capacity. The radio remained silent after that exchange. I wrote the time and contact details into the operations journal, underlining the phrase they had repeated, water holds. Concrete stands. Outside, the valley remained dark. Infected still drifted along the bridge and shoreline. Nothing visible had changed. Inside, everything had. For the first time since the outbreak began, survival was no longer a purely mechanical problem. It had become a human one. The food ledger stopped pretending on day 31. I had been projecting consumption curves every morning, adjusting calorie intake down by small margins to stretch inventory. That morning, the margin vanished. Even at minimal daily intake, the combined total of vending stock, emergency rations, and supplemental reserves would last no more than 84 days. Less if I factored in increased workload from maintenance and spillway management. The dam produced power and filtered water. It did not produce calories. If the downstream group moved north, 7 additional people would collapse my projections entirely. Even if they never arrived, my own reserves were finite. Isolation bought time, not permanence. I pulled up topographical maps of the reservoir perimeter and marked known structures within reachable distance. The nearest viable target was an abandoned ranger station on the western shoreline, used seasonally for park operations. It sat less than 2 miles across open water, accessible by a maintenance boat stored in the lower dock enclosure. 2 miles across water meant limited ground exposure. It also meant engine noise. I descended to the lower level and inspected the aluminum maintenance boat. The fuel tank was half full, enough for multiple crossings if used conservatively. The engine, however, would announce my presence across the valley. Sound carried over water more efficiently than over forest. I ran a risk comparison. Overland approach, impossible without clearing the infected bridge cluster. Boat approach, rapid transit, minimal land contact, high acoustic signature. Remaining stationary, gradual starvation. The equation favored motion. I prepared systematically. 2 empty supply crates, rope harness, handheld radio with fresh batteries, sidearm with limited ammunition. No long rifle. The recoil noise would be catastrophic in open water. The objective was retrieval, not engagement. Timing mattered. I observed shoreline activity through cameras for 12 hours. Movement thinned between 04, 00 and 06, 00 when the temperature dipped and mechanical output remained low. If I cut turbine vibration to a minimal threshold before departure, overall valley resonance would be reduced. Fewer acoustic cues layered together meant less attraction. At 03:45, I powered down non-essential systems again, reducing internal hum to its quietest stable state. The dam felt dormant, almost lifeless. I locked the control room, sealed the stairwell, and descended to the dock. The reservoir at pre-dawn was glass. No wind. No visible shoreline movement. I lowered the boat into the water manually, avoiding sudden metallic impacts. When I pulled the starter cord, the engine coughed once before settling into a controlled idle. The sound felt enormous. I pushed off gently and increased throttle only enough to maintain forward motion. A wake trailed behind in faint ripples. The dam receded in my peripheral vision, rising like a silent wall against the dim sky. Midway across, I scanned the shoreline through binoculars. No immediate figures. The ranger station dock appeared intact. Windows dark. No visible structural damage. I cut the engine 50 yards from shore and drifted, letting momentum carry me the rest of the distance. Silence returned slowly as the propeller stilled. I secured the boat and stepped onto the dock with deliberate calm. The ranger station door was locked but brittle. I forced entry with minimal impact, entering quickly and closing it behind me. Inside, shelves remained partially stocked: canned goods, dry rice, medical kits. Seasonal staff had likely fled quickly, leaving supplies behind. I moved efficiently, filling crates without greed. Weight equaled vulnerability. 2 crates, nothing more. Outside, faint movement registered near the tree line. I did not investigate. I carried the crates back to the dock, re-entered the boat, and allowed drift before restarting the engine. This time, shoreline figures responded immediately, drawn toward the sound in uneven clusters. They did not reach the water in time to intercept. By the time I approached the dam dock again, at least a dozen had gathered along the western bank. The calculation had been correct. Risk was temporary. Starvation would not have been. I hauled the crates up the maintenance ramp and sealed the lower access behind me. Back in the control room, I logged the new inventory totals. The addition extended personal survival projections by at least 60 days. Outside, the shoreline population remained elevated from the disturbance. Inside, my margin had widened. The dam still stood, but permanence required motion beyond concrete. The second crossing was not as quiet. I had hoped the shoreline reaction from the first supply run would fade within days, but residual movement lingered along the western bank. The infected did not disperse completely. They drifted in loose arcs as though orbiting a memory of the engine's vibration. That meant the next trip would carry greater exposure. Exposure, however, was preferable to depletion. I recalculated weight tolerance on the maintenance boat, adjusting crate capacity to reduce engine strain. Less throttle meant less noise. I also timed departure earlier, 03:10 instead of 03:45, to intersect the narrowest activity window before dawn. When I lowered the boat this time, I avoided even the faint metallic scrape from the pulley system. Every motion felt deliberate, rehearsed. The reservoir lay darker than before, overcast sky mooting starlight. Reduced visibility cut both ways. I was harder to see, but so were shoreline figures. I allowed the boat to drift farther from the dam before engaging the engine. When it finally turned over, the sound seemed sharper in the cold air. I kept speed minimal, using steering corrections rather than acceleration to maintain direction. Halfway across, I noticed movement to my left. Not on the ranger station side, closer to the central shoreline beneath the bridge. Several figures had moved closer to the water line, stepping ankle-deep into the shallows. They did not swim. They simply pressed forward until resistance halted them. The engine had drawn them. I adjusted course slightly, widening my arc to approach the Ranger dock from a shallower angle. The infected on the western bank responded more slowly this time, perhaps disoriented by reduced turbine vibration from my earlier power adjustments. Their reaction lag bought seconds. Seconds were enough. At the dock, I cut the engine completely and used a pole to push the boat silently against the wood. I unloaded quickly. Inside the Ranger station, I targeted only high-density items: rice sacks, canned protein, sealed medical supplies. No exploratory searching. No unnecessary noise. On the return trip, shoreline response intensified. The infected clustered more rapidly, some stumbling directly into the water in blind pursuit of sound. They thrashed in waist-deep shallows, but did not coordinate. None advanced far enough to threaten the boat's path. The reservoir functioned as both moat and amplifier. As I neared the dam, a new complication emerged. 2 infected had reached the lower maintenance ramp, likely drawn from previous crossings. They pressed against the dock gate, hands scraping metal mesh. I could not approach directly without forcing contact. I throttled briefly to redirect their focus, circling 20 yards outward before cutting the engine again. The change in acoustic direction pulled them sideways along the dock fence, creating a narrow opening. I seized the gap, drifting in and securing the boat before they reoriented. Inside the lower corridor, I locked the dock access and carried the crates upward. My breathing was controlled, but faster than I preferred. The crossings were becoming cumulative triggers, building shoreline density over time. Back in the control room, I studied the external feeds. The western bank now showed a steady population of infected lingering near the Ranger station area. The reservoir had not diluted their numbers, it had redistributed them. Each trip expanded food supply, but increased perimeter pressure. The dam remained structurally secure, yet its acoustic footprint was shaping the valley's movement patterns. Every engine started etching memory into whatever instincts drove those bodies. If crossings continued at the same frequency, the shoreline would eventually saturate. I entered new projections into the ledger. 2 additional runs would extend survival through winter. More than that would risk attracting sustained clusters beyond manageable levels. The equation shifted again. Water protected me from immediate assault, but it could not erase sound. The reservoir crossing had proven viable, yet viability narrowed with repetition. For now, supplies were sufficient. For now, the dam still felt dominant. But the margin between control and escalation was thinning with each ripple across the water. The infected were predictable. Humans were not. I noticed the truck just before noon. It wasn't moving fast, and it wasn't erratic. It rolled slowly along the upper access road, stopping well short of the blocked bridge. Through the surveillance zoom, I counted 3 figures inside the cab. Clean clothing. Deliberate posture. Not wandering. They had come looking. I muted all external audio and reduced turbine vibration by another degree, minimizing the dam's acoustic signature. The truck engine idled briefly, then shut off. The 3 men stepped out and moved toward the gate with measured caution. One carried binoculars. Another held what looked like a rifle slung across his back. They were not drawn by instinct. They were assessing value. The dam represented water, elevation, and potential power. Anyone thinking beyond the next meal would recognize that immediately. I had assumed isolation was protection. I had not accounted for strategy. The men approached the sedan still wedged across the entrance. One kicked the tire. Another scanned the bridge through optics. Their movements were efficient. They spoke to each other in short exchanges I could not hear but could read in body language. Agreement, direction, confirmation. One of them pointed upward, toward the control room. I stepped back from the glass instinctively, then forced myself forward again. Hiding behind reinforced windows was meaningless if they already knew someone was here. The turbine output graphs still showed minimal vibration, but any sustained activity would signal occupation. The man with binoculars lingered, studying the structure. He turned slowly, scanning spillway walls, intake grates, and maintenance ramp. Mapping weaknesses. Unlike the infected, these men could test them. After several minutes, one of them retrieved a metal tool from the truck bed, something heavy. They approached the gate and struck it experimentally. The impact reverberated up the bridge and through the dam's frame. I watched the stress indicator for the lower hinge assembly spike briefly, then settle. They struck again, harder. This was not mindless repetition. It was probing. I considered my options. Opening spillway gates would create distraction, but reveal active management. Shutting turbines down completely might signal abandonment, but would reduce my operational leverage. Engaging them directly was impossible without exposing myself. They struck the gate a third time. One crouched near the hinge, inspecting structural integrity. The dam had become more than shelter. It had become a resource. If they breached the lower maintenance entrance, they would gain access to corridors leading upward. Even if they could not overpower me physically, they could starve me out by damaging external infrastructure. I moved to the spillway control panel and adjusted the release valves by 5%. The sudden rush of water thundered into the gorge, vibration rolling outward. On the surveillance monitor, the men paused, startled by the roar. They turned toward the spillway in unison. The sound shifted their attention. Seconds later, infected from the surrounding forest began drifting toward the renewed noise. The bridge population thickened, drawn by the spillway's concussive echo. The men retreated toward their truck, watching the growing movement near the gate. One of them raised his rifle, scanning the tree line rather than the dam. The calculus had changed for them. Human intent retreated in the face of greater chaos. After several tense minutes, they climbed back into the truck and reversed carefully up the access road, disappearing behind the ridge. I held the spillway at 5% release for another minute before closing it slowly. The roar subsided. The infected remained clustered near the bridge, agitated but uncoordinated. I leaned back in the operator's chair, heart steady but heavier. The infected were an environmental hazard. The men in the truck were competition. The dam's value had been noticed. Isolation was no longer invisible protection. It was a contested advantage. They came back 3 days later. This time there were 5 of them. 2 trucks stopped short of the bridge, positioned diagonally along the access road as if expecting resistance. Through the surveillance zoom, I saw heavier tools in the truck beds, crowbars, sledgehammers, and something that looked dangerously close to a portable cutting torch. They had learned from the first attempt. I reduced turbine output immediately, minimizing vibration cues. Silence would not deter them now. They were operating on sight and strategy. One man raised binoculars again, scanning the dam's upper windows. I remained seated, but shifted away from direct reflection in the glass. They approached the gate with coordination. One man positioned himself at the hinge. Another placed what appeared to be a hydraulic jack against the metal seam, attempting to force separation from structural anchoring. The stress indicator on the lower hinge assembly spiked sharply. Unlike infected bodies, mechanical leverage could defeat reinforced steel. I moved to the spillway control console and studied downstream topography. The lower access road curved beneath the bridge before rising toward the forest. If I released enough water quickly, it would surge through the river channel and overrun the base of that road. Not enough to threaten the dam itself, but enough to erase their approach route. The risk was timing. Too little discharge, and they would continue prying. Too much and structural strain would exceed safe tolerance margins. I opened spillway gate 1 to 15%. The effect was immediate. Water exploded down the chute with violent force, striking the river channel below in a white torrent. Within seconds, the lower access road began to flood. The men at the gate staggered backward, startled by the sudden vibration underfoot. I increased to 20%. The river surged over its banks along the base of the bridge. Water climbed the lower ramp, submerging the maintenance approach within minutes. The trucks on the upper road remained untouched, but their escape corridor beneath the bridge was gone. The men retreated quickly, abandoning the hydraulic jack. One slipped on wet concrete, scrambling to regain footing as the river continued to rise. They had expected resistance, but not environmental transformation. From the control room, I monitored structural pressure levels carefully. Reservoir drop rate remained within safe bounds. Downstream discharge peaked, but did not breach flood containment projections. The lower road disappeared completely under churning water. The dam had become an island. The men retreated to their trucks and reversed up the ridge without attempting further assault. They did not fire weapons. They did not linger. They recognized the shift in terrain. I held the gates open for 90 seconds longer than necessary, ensuring the lower road's foundation saturated thoroughly. When I finally reduced discharge gradually, the river remained elevated enough to deter immediate return. Outside, infected clustered chaotically along the flooded bridge base, drawn to vibration and water movement. Some lost footing and were swept downstream. The river was indifferent. Inside, I leaned forward over the console, breathing measured and controlled. The decision had protected the structure, but it had consequences. With the lower access road compromised, overland evacuation routes were effectively gone. If mechanical failure ever forced abandonment, boat escape would be the only option. The dam was no longer a high-ground retreat, it was a permanent commitment. I logged the flood event in the operations journal, noting discharge percentage, duration, and observed human retreat behavior. The hydraulic jack remained wedged near the gate, half submerged in receding water. They would not forget this. The dam had defended itself not with weapons, but with pressure and timing. I had chosen environmental leverage over direct confrontation. It was efficient, decisive, and isolating. Concrete stood, water answered, and the valley now understood that this structure was defended. They arrived at dusk. Not by road, by waters. The radio transmission the night before had been brief and controlled. "Water holds," the voice had said. No elaboration. No plea. Just confirmation. I responded with the agreed phrase and shut down communication immediately. If they were moving, they were already exposed. From the western shoreline camera, I saw the boat first. Small, improvised, paddled rather than motorized. Smart. No engine noise. 7 figures inside, spaced carefully for balance. One stood near the bow, scanning the dam's face with deliberate attention. They had chosen silence. I powered down turbine output by 2%, reducing internal vibration further. The dam's hum softened until it felt almost suspended. I did not want to be infected along the bridge, reacting to a sudden acoustic shift while the boat crossed open water. The shoreline population remained moderate. The earlier flood had redistributed some movement downstream, thinning clusters near the ranger station. For now, the reservoir offered them a corridor. The boat approached cautiously, angling toward the maintenance dock rather than the main spillway. Good instincts. They had read the structure correctly. I descended to the lower corridor, but stopped short of unlocking the dock gate. Through the steel mesh, I watched them secure the boat quietly. 7 faces, drawn but alert. 2 carried makeshift crutches. 1 woman scanned the upper windows, searching for confirmation. I stepped into view deliberately. No sudden movement. No raised weapon. Just presence. The woman nodded once. Concrete stands. She called softly. I considered the weight of what I was about to do. Alone, I controlled intake, output, ration, vibration. Alone, projections were precise. Alone, survival was mechanical. Together, survival would become human. Water holds, I replied. I unlocked the dock gate. The sound of the bolt sliding back felt louder than any spillway discharge. It was not thunderous, not violent, just decisive. One by one, they stepped through, carrying minimal supplies. They moved carefully, aware of exposure but not panicked. Inside the lower corridor, I secured the gate behind them immediately. The dam felt different already. Air displaced by more breathing. Footsteps multiplying along concrete. Upstairs in the control room, I laid out food inventory sheets and system schematics. No speeches. No emotional declarations. Just data. We have filtered water, I said. Limited food. Power generation is stable. Shoreline activity moderate. Overland access was compromised. They listened without interruption. The man who had spoken on the radio stepped forward. We can rotate watch shifts. The two of us have mechanical experience. We can ration with you. With you. The phrase settled deeper than I expected. I studied their faces again. Fatigue, caution, resolve. They were not marauders. They were not infected. They were variables that increased both risk and resilience. I looked through the observation glass toward the bridge. The infected still wandered across it in uneven clusters. The world below remained fractured and volatile. But here, inside reinforced concrete and controlled systems, possibility expanded. I returned to the spillway controls and adjusted turbine output slightly upward, restoring a stable internal hum. The sound no longer felt like a solitary responsibility. It was shared infrastructure. Isolation had given me survival. Community might give this place longevity. As night settled across the reservoir, 7 additional silhouettes stood behind reinforced glass, watching the valley with me. The dam was no longer just a control room above chaos. It was becoming something else. Not a fortress, a foundation,